Okay, so people online did not hear a word I said, but that's no great loss. So we've got, okay, I'm a little confused. So we got two papers, right? And three panelists, great, so beautiful. I will go ahead then and introduce Azamat Junisbai from Pitzer College, talking about, it says up on the screen, limits of authoritarian learning making sense of January 2022 events in Kazakhstan. Please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you all so much. Yeah, switching gears. I am from Kazakhstan, born and raised in Almaty, and I happened to be in Kazakhstan for winter break with my 13-year-old, without 13-year-old, when this happened. And it was shocking, right? Kazakhstan, at some point for me, I've been following things obsessively there for most of my adult life. And I've kind of started to tune out recently the last few years because it just seemed like such a stagnant situation, nothing new happening, right? So I stopped following as closely the appointments and, you know, who was replacing whom and whatnot. But then this happened, right? And it was shocking for the violence of it, the extent of it. In Kazakhstan's 30-year history, we have not seen the scale, right? We certainly have seen violence. We have not seen the scale of the events of this sort. We've not seen the sort of the manifest inability or unwillingness of law enforcement to do anything, right? In that situation, the looting that happened, right? So the people broke into shops, right? People stole from cash machines, right? Just all kinds of things happen, right? People died. People died. There's still a lot of information that's hidden, honestly, right? About what went on exactly. And trying to understand, so this last picture, it's the inside of what used to be, before the capital moved from Almaty, what used to be the presidential administration, then it became the mayor's office in Almaty, right? It burned down completely, right? So this is inside of that, right? Also, another on the list of things I never thought I would see in Kazakhstan, right? So Tajik peacekeepers in Almaty. And so, you know, the question that captivated all of us was what happened? What was the deal? And I think you could think of sort of the obvious candidates, right? So it was a peaceful protest. Obviously, what it began, it's been downplayed by the government, the fact that it was a peaceful protest with legitimate economic and social demands. But so that was a peaceful protest that escalated. Another option, it was an attempted coup against President Tokayev. My own sense at this point, it was both combination of A and B, right? Or perhaps folks here have other ideas, and I'd love to hear that. Right, so you all, of course, know, right, that Nazarbayev shocked Kazakhstan in 2019 when he just went on TV in the spring in March and said, I've reached a difficult decision, I'm stepping down, right? And then he continued talking about what would happen after he stepped down, and it became clear that this was kind of a strange resignation in that he stepped down from his post as president, but retained a tremendous amount of power, right? Control over the entire security apparatus, lifelong chairmanship of the Security Council, all kinds of things, right? So stepping down, but not really. And why were they doing this convoluted, strange thing? I think the answer is fairly common sense, right? That people who have benefited fantastically under Nazarbayev's rule have a lot to lose, right? So most recently in Kazakhstan, this particular figure made the news. Tokayev even talked about, right, that 55% of Kazakhstan total wealth, according to this 2019 report, is held by 162 people, right? And a lot of these people, their names are known to everyone in Kazakhstan, right? And some of the larger figures, of course, are people who are in the extended family of President Nazarbayev, as those affiliated. And so, again, you just see headlines like this all the time. At some point, it begins to just kind of become jaded, right? Yeah, this happens. Yeah, they're hiding their money. You know, what's new, right? And you know, I think the reason they had this particular format of transition was because they were terrified of experiencing the fate of those who were close to Karimov, right? Karimov died, and that became a huge problem for those in his inner circle, a very difficult problem, right? So I actually tend to agree with what Tokayev has said publicly, is that this was a coup attempt, right? So I think, in fact, it was a coup attempt. But the issue, of course, is, okay, so coup attempt by who? Right, and that's a tricky question in Kazakhstan today. I would even say it's a dangerous question to ask, right? I am reminded here of this famous quip by Churchill, right, about the bulldog fight under a rug. It's strangely, I find it quite useful in trying to understand exactly who was involved in this fight under a rug, right? So what we can know, because publicly there's been no invocation of Nazarbayev's extended family members as having been involved, or God forbid, Nazarbayev himself, but we certainly can analyze, so to speak, bone fragments flying out from under that rug, right? And I think bone fragments are quite telling, right? So you can see a lot of what happened just looking at the headlines, right? And, you know, you don't have to, again, to have sort of a long attention span to get the picture here, right? So it's a, even those most cynical friends of mine in Kazakhstan who say, oh, nothing has changed, nothing will ever change here, are forced to admit that this position of the family and those who are the extended members of the family and their inner circle has weakened dramatically in Kazakhstan. I think that's no longer controversial. And, you know, of course, the question is, okay, so what? What next? And I think the answers to these questions will be very impactful for Kazakhstan going forward, right? So right now, it appears that Kazakh government's official line is that it was the ex-head of the KNB, right? So essentially successor organization to the KGB, a man who is half ethnic Uyghur, who was behind this coup. So for anyone though who follows Kazakhstan's political scene even a little bit, they know Masimov has always been President Nazarbayev's right-hand man. And the fact that, you know, the idea that he would try to get this power for himself, an ethnic Uyghur in Kazakhstan, it's a little bit of a stretch, right? To quote a friend of mine, and it's very crass, I'm sorry, but he said, you know, Masimov would not dare fart without Nazarbayev's permission, right? So make of that what you will. But, you know, the challenges going forward. So if the Kazakh government right now is unable to make it very clear who was behind the coup, what does it mean for their ability to, you know, bring forth Novy Kazakhstan, new Kazakhstan, right? So what's going to happen? How much do appointments matter? Because people are disappointed with some of the appointments that have been made, right? The fact there are so many recycled, greasy, sort of old deck cards people there, how much does that matter? Kazakhstan's law enforcement is a basket case, a disastrous, really horrible. Well, but that's the law enforcement they have, right? So what does that mean for the future? And then, yeah, I do believe that, Kazakh government had no choice but to call for the help of CSTO, right? So collective security organization, because Tokayev had no control, had no ability to immediately use his own security services because of that power arrangement that they had. But, with every kind of assistance like that, there's a price. I'm hearing voices from Kazakhstan now who are saying, well, because Putin got himself into this horrible trap in Ukraine, whatever our obligations or Kazakh elite's obligations toward him might no longer be quite so constraining. Maybe that's kind of a gentle way to put that, right? But yeah, I don't know. And so how much of this with the investigations, right? How much of this will come to light? How much will this be investigated? The government has stopped pushing this issue that they first were saying, oh, it's 20,000 foreign terrorists, including this guy, right, who turned out to be a piano jazz musician from Bishkek, who they tried to present as a foreign terrorist, right? So a lot of the really silly stuff that they tried to push at the beginning, they no longer try to say. But the prospects for genuine reform, I think, will depend on the answers to some of these questions. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Okay, it's over here. So up next, I don't know, we didn't discuss this ahead of time, how you're going to present together. Right, now I'm just getting it, but as I do that, I was going to say, so the next paper is by Dinissa Duvanova from Lehigh University and Barbara Junisbai from Pitzer College, the repertoire of, assuming I can find it here, I can't read. Repertoire of Repression and Post-Soviet Autocracies, what can we learn from Kazakhstan's failed coup? So picking up where Azamat left off.
So we are splitting the presentation. I will start and Barbara will finish. All right, and what do I do to go?
So the arrow
I got it.
keys,
All right. So as Azamat had described, there are a lot of questions, and we still do not have a clear picture of what really happened in January in Almaty and other cities in Kazakhstan, how to characterize those events. What we did with Barbara, we took a specific analytical lens for which to try to make sense of those events. And what we focus on is on the one element in the sort of one specific group of those people who are on the streets instigating violence, right? So we did not focus on the peaceful protesters. We did not focus on the people who participated in looting. We focused on the sort of one element that we find to be very important to understand in order to sort of situate the events of January in a larger sort of framework of authoritarian politics in Kazakhstan. So basically, we find that if we look at that one element, one specific group of people who participated in those protests, it actually allows us to compare and find a lot of parallels to, specifically in the memo, we focused on Ukrainian Euromaidan revolution and events that followed sort of with the separatism in eastern Ukraine, and also we find similar patterns in Tulip revolution in Kyrgyz Republic, right? So those are, we're trying to figure out who were those people, and we are placing those those provocateurs in a larger context of regional politics. For the most part, those provocateurs in other cases we analyzed were associated with the use, it was Yanukovych who used provocateurs to sabotage Euromaidan protests, right? But we also sort of find that, going back to Ukrainian context, those same titushkis were used once the regime transition has happened. The same kind of forces were used to destabilize, to upset the status quo, so to attack the government, the legitimate government of the country. So basically, as I said, we find a lot of parallels. So those are pictures with from three different countries, different sort of time periods. So this is the person who gave the name to this phenomenon in Ukrainian titushki. So it's in Ukrainian politics, we have a term for that. This is how those people look like in Kyrgyzstan during tulip revolution, and this is how they looked in Kazakhstan in January of this year. So they kind of, and in the memo we sort of discuss how they seem to be drawn from the same social demographics. The kinds of actions they committed. So burning the building of the Profsoyuz building in Kiev, setting cars on fire, and in Kazakhstan, in Bishkek, and then in Almaty, you see both in that picture, right? So that same kind of repertoire of violent action, just creating a sense of chaos on the streets, setting buildings on fire, attacking property, sort of destroying property, looting, all those things were present in all those cases. Also, we focus on how sort of there are visible signs, not only sort of the post-factum accounts, but also visible signs of those groups, those actors being organized, having resources, and also being highly coordinated, right? So they do appear to have uniforms, right? They're uniform, they dress so they can see each other in the crowd. Look on all those, the same exact codes here, right? So they are being transported to the places where protests happen. They march together to target specific buildings, right? So they have walkie-talkies to communicate with each other. So we identify all those things in three different countries' contexts. So I will switch it to Barbara.
All right, so can everybody hear me? My voice isn't usually very loud. All right, so Dinissa set up the stage for what we're going to talk about, which is the use of provocateurs by elites in authoritarian countries. And I'm going to specifically focus on how provocateurs were used in Kazakhstan in January of 2022, focusing specifically on the second capital, the financial capital, former capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty. All right, so as Dinissa said, we noticed that oftentimes provocateurs are used by those who are in power to maintain power. So they're informal state actors, often criminal elements or athletes, and elites use them to fend off opposition, to get rid of challengers. But in the case of Almaty, what's really interesting is that the use of provocation was specifically to undermine a standing president. So to undermine President Tokayev versus shore up President Tokayev against opponents. Can I move that little? Sorry. There it goes. Okay. All right. So, you know, as Azamat had said, there were peaceful protests. Right? There were peaceful protests, people who had legitimate reason to be upset with the system. You know, the events in Kazakhstan that happened, they occurred on the West, right? And Zhana was in protests over declining standards of living and protests over the rise in the cost of that liquefied petroleum. And what we're going to talk about is infiltration of legitimate demonstrations by provocateurs, right? And so, as I said earlier, this was an attempt by elites, and Azamat asked, but what elites, right? To overthrow an incumbent president. And as we know, that attempted coup was ultimately unsuccessful, that Tokayev was able to shore up his resources, but there was a moment when it wasn't clear what was going to happen. So we argue that even if the provocation was ultimately unsuccessful, it is important to look at because it reveals these intra-elite dynamics that are usually hidden from view. So we find that, as Dinissa said, there's an elite provocateur connection in many contexts, not only in Kazakhstan. In the case of Kazakhstan, the use of provocation to shift the balance of power reveals these intra-regime divisions, specifically in this case between Tokayev and, we're going to argue, President Nazarbayev's family. And also it has implications for, like, at one point, Tokayev looked incredibly weak. I think in Azamat's memo, he refers to Tokayev as mebel, a piece of furniture, which is what a lot of people said. So he looked incredibly weak. And then all of a sudden, he looked incredibly strong, right, when the provocation was put down. All right, so we're going to talk about what took place with a focus on Almaty. And what's important here is, as Dinissa said, provocateurs come from a certain social demographic, right? So we find that provocateurs in Almaty were mobilized from religious organizations, from, like, sports groups, and also from the bazaars and the markets. They were all, oh shoot, that was fast. All right, they came from, and they were most ethnic Kazakhs, right? But what's so interesting in the case of Kazakhstan is at the same time that the mobilization of provocateurs occurred, demobilization of the police and the security forces occurred. So right when the provocateurs were wreaking havoc on the city, there was no police to be seen, right? So this was this question, the series of questions that I found across social media and in the regular media. So how was any of this possible, right? Why were security forces, which were otherwise intolerant of demonstrations and far less threatening manifestations of anti-government sentiment, unable to prevent this outbreak of chaos? And why did security services give up the city and return only after Tokayev appealed to the CSTO, right? So this is a really interesting dynamic. And then what I'm going to argue is that Almaty is the Vochina, the fiefdom of the Nazarbayev family. And that, as Azamat said, Massimov can't do what Massimov does without the president's permission. Many people say nothing takes place in Almaty without the family's consent. So I'm going to name 3 people. So based on local observers and political scientists discussions, these 3 people, the President Nazarbayev, first president's brother-in-law, his 2 nephews, Khairat Satabaldi and Samat Abish, were really central to this. And why? Because his brother-in-law is said to control the market. His nephew, I didn't say son-in-law, I meant nephew. His younger brother controls the markets in Almaty, and we all know this is the person who is in control of the former KGB, right? The security services, and this person is in control of religious organizations, the same exact 3 groups of people who were engaged in the provocation. All right, so why was provocateurs, why were they mobilized? Basically, we think it's to showcase Tokayev's ineffectiveness as a leader and to delegitimize popular protests, and to do this, right, to regain control, because Tokayev was trying to consolidate power at the expense of the family, and they wanted to shift the balance of power back to them. All right, so we'll just leave this here for observation.
Great. Okay, so while we're getting questions together, you can read the slide. No, the people online are muted. I don't think that we are. Although I could be wrong about that. That's correct. Okay, great. So thank you. So here we can see the questions. Please, if you're online, please go ahead and post your questions to the chat and I will read them off. I don't see any here, so I will take them as they come up in the audience, starting here with Ted. Why don't we take them in groups
So-
of well, 2 or 3, and we'll see how it goes.
So I have 2 questions. One for Azamat. Could you expound more on your view of how Russia's involvement in the Kazakh crisis is? I believe I heard you say at the end that you think that the Ukraine invasion changed how that's perceived within Kazakhstan. But I'd like to just hear your thoughts more about that specifically. Like, what's the implication of that? And then for Dinissa and Barbara, I think this is a great, fascinating idea. And indeed, you know, as you were first talking, I thought, well, that's just like Kyrgyzstan, right? And so, yeah, I mean, but I think this is a broad phenomenon. It definitely, but what is your sort of sociology, if I may say, of this provocateur group? I mean, is this a case? Is it really consistent across the 3 countries? Is it different kind of social milieu that these people come from? Are they organized through social media, through these organizations, or are they just kind of like a lumpenized mass, as one might say, that can be mobilized when it's convenient for police to do so, but then they kind of dissociate themselves? And or is it the same across the countries? And then finally, I mean, what about January 6th? Do we see something similar in this country?
Okay, well, I'm going to take a couple more questions because there's a bunch of hands up, and so we can take them together. Mikhail.
Hi, Mikhail Alexeyev, San Diego State University. Again, fascinating topic you guys have on provocateurs. A well-known tool of autocrats. Stalin used to hire whistlers and hecklers and enforcers. It almost looks like the sociology of the political mafia when you have enforcers or disruptors or things like that. But I'm curious. I'm not sure exactly, how you trace that process. Who exactly called the shots, because they're usually for hire. So who hired them in Kazakhstan? Is it possible to find out? And could it be a false flag operation with Russian participation, given the interesting kind of coincidence in timing and mobilization and demobilization that you outlined? And it would be consistent with Putin's goal of de-Nazarbyefication of Kazakhstan.
Okay, I'm going to take one question from online, and then we'll come back to the room after the speakers have a chance to reply. So there's a question here from Irina Busigina, joining us from online. I'm assuming I don't know from where actually. Kazakhstan is a big country. She writes, "What was the territorial distribution of the protests? Was it only in Almaty and Zhanaozen, or were there protests in other regions and cities that we should be paying attention to?" So why don't we go in the order, actually, both of the questions and the presentations. So Azamat.
So to your question, how the situation in Ukraine is impacting. One thing, I just pulled up the slide, just I ran out of time. So one fascinating thing that happened in Almaty in the last couple of weeks, there was a government sanctioned rally, and Kazakhstan does not have a rich history of allowing mass rallies for anything, right? There was a rally that was allowed to go ahead by the authorities that was against the war, right? So this is actually my cousin and his fiance, right, in the picture, right? And so, but it's fascinating, right? So that it seems that Tokayev is walking a tightrope right now because they want nothing to do with the Russian invasion, but certainly there was a widespread perception that he is in Putin's debt after having been rescued, right? But then the issue is now that Putin is essentially a war criminal for all purposes, right? So if your debt is to a war criminal, what does it mean for your debt, right? And the answer to that, perhaps we'll see, or I'd be curious to see what people think. Geographic distribution of protests, it was not limited to Almaty at all. That's the striking thing about it, right? So it was all over the country, right? Taraz, Shymkent, just about every regional capital, right? In Taldykorgan, the statue of Nazarbayev was pulled off the pedestal with a truck, right? So it happened all over, and I completely agree with Denissa's and Barbara's point, is that I think it was an attempt to show that Tokayev was impotent to stop this. He couldn't, there was nothing, because it's all about the projection of power. Being strong is very important, and clearly this was meant to show that he could not control the security situation. And the next logical step is he needs to step down, allow someone who can control this. To what extent can you consider this to be a false flag Russian operation? I don't know. I think if I am Tokayev and I need Putin's support, I could make a pretty strong argument that if you allow Nazarbayev's, those folks in the pictures that Barbara showed, if you allow them to come to power, things will not improve for Russians in Kazakhstan, to put it mildly, right? So Tokayev is a Russian-speaking person. He's learning Kazakh now, but I think you can make a pretty credible case that if you care about the fate of Russians in Kazakhstan, support me over them. But I'm happy to talk more about it.
All right, so I really like the question about the sociology of the provocateurs, right? You know, for me, more interesting question actually. I mean, there are the parallels across those three countries can go only so far, right? So we have different different social groups and classes, and they are organized. They have different sort of glues that tie them together. They have different sources of income. They have different type of dependency on the state or on some traditional sort of relationships. However, for me, an interesting question that can tie them together is actually organization and institutional sort of framework in which provocateurs are being recruited and used and directed, right? And I think there we can find in the institutional framework, we can find more connection and more similarities rather than, but we do find, as to the socio-demographics of the provocateurs, we do find a lot of parallels, right? And those parallels actually go back to the organizational structure of the society rather than the sort of your standard socio-demographic divisions, right? So it's not really the cleavages, it's the organizations that might overlap with those social cleavages. So that would be sort of my take on it. And I also wanted to address this this question of whether, you know, the false flag sort of operation and who were those entities who hired provocateurs, right? So going back to both Kyrgyz and Ukrainian cases, there were elements of those provocateurs who were for hire, and there were also those who perhaps did some face some other incentives. So there are a number of articles discussing Tushki that links the regional police authorities sort of informal work with the ex-convicts. So there could be some coercive element in that, right? So they were probably, you know, some of those Titushkis were doing it not for monetary sort of rewards, but out of the fear of being sort of implicated in some sort of some criminal investigations and whatnot, right? So there could be some other mechanism, not necessarily sort of direct monetary incentives. But also what we see in Kazakh media reports is that sort of that the parts of those provocateurs who were sort of best organized, there are sort of reports of those being sort of previously trained sort of private violence perpetrating units. Right. So that is sort of to go to who were the, and Barbara outlined clearly who are those people who are in charge of those organizations, right? So we know their names.
I don't have that much to add, but I did want to say, if we think back to when President Nazarbayev was in office, one of his most famous relatives is his son-in-law, who is no longer with us, right? Rahat Aliyev, who was married to then President Nazarbayev's eldest daughter, Dariga. Rahat Aliyev had a history of using violence, both formally, like with his position in the KNB, but also using informal sources of violence to murder opponents And I remember when Azamat and I, we were working for the State Department, we lived in Kazakhstan. In 2001, there was a opposition movement, the Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan. And we went to one of the rallies and there were we saw the provocateurs getting out of the vehicles and, pumping themselves up. And but they were there in support of the state, right? To fight against peaceful protesters and to delegitimize the opposition. So it's not unusual that the family members of the former president would have access to these groups because they used those same mechanisms, organized mechanisms in support of President Nazarbayev when he was in office. And now just the switch it was against the incumbent president rather than for.
I just wanted to add quickly the inaction of police and special services is completely unusual. Actually, Denissa's father is one of the most fearless democracy activists in Kazakhstan's history. He has been arrested and carried away from the main square in Almaty for doing a one-man protest within minutes of standing there, right? The fact that they had allowed the cities to be taken over in multiple regional capitals is completely abnormal.
Okay, so we've got a couple more hands here that I see. 3. Okay, look, we got about 4 minutes before the next panel starts, so we're gonna have to try to do this very quickly. I'm gonna ask you to keep yourselves to one question, and hopefully we'll get through it all. So you had your hand up in the last round, yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Frank Marachiono, University of Sheffield, and visiting scholar here at GW. My question is about the role of the CSTO troops. So you sort of let us understand that Tokayev needed the intervention of the CSTO and therefore some practical result from the intervention of the CSTO. So do you have a comment on what in practice the CSTO peacekeepers did in the crisis?
Scott.
It's always hard to figure out what the Bulldogs are doing under the carpet, and you've done a good job. I think you're about 80% of the way there, though. The evidence you have is all circumstantial for now. I think a couple more bits of evidence would make a much more solid case. One, is there any direct evidence of the provocateurs being paid, being told what to do, being organized? If there are thousands of these people, there must be evidence of this happening somewhere on social media, through interviews, somehow. And the other question is, why the coup? Why did Nazarbayev do this? Why did he do it now? If this is the case, shouldn't there have been some inkling of this in advance? Rumblings on the street, rumors circulating that Nazarbayev and his people are unhappy. If there's some of that, that'll also strengthen your case.
And then there's a question over here on this side, but while the microphone's making its way, I'll read off a question from online. From Roshan Zhandayeva, who says, thank you for the presentations. In what ways do you think the provocateurs were recruited? How did they learn their strategies? What was their motivation? Is it just financial reward? So this also fits into any evidence you have that might answer Scott's question.
Sure. Hi, Alex Sanchez, James Defense. Quick question. What do you think was the role, if any, of Mukhtar Ablyasov, the businessman that stole $7 billion? Did he have any kind of role during the protest? Thank you.
Okay, easy questions. So why don't we bring that all back to the panel and we'll wrap it up. Maybe I'll go in the same order, I guess. So start with. If you can keep the answers brief, though, I would be great.
I think 0 for Ablyazov, despite what he might want to claim. Yeah, no role for him. I agree, evidence is circumstantial. I also agree that there should be something, but if you're willing to look, right now there is a decision not to look. And that's what I was trying to say, is that if you make a decision not to look, not to look in that direction, you're essentially sort of you're standing on one leg, trying to do something for the future. Is it possible? Right? Is it sustainable? They are choosing to not look there, right? That's why all I have are these little headlines, right? Because officially they've been dismissed. No, nothing else.
Rumblings in the streets among the family, yes. So there were signs before the attempted coup that President Tokayev was trying to consolidate power and to push family members out of formal positions. So there are some, and we will definitely look into that. Raushan Zhandayeva, who is my former student and a PhD student now with Authoritarian here. How were they recruited? So I think in this case, there may have been people being paid, but a lot of folks were really tied closely through the religious organizations and through religious charities that were funded by President Nazarbayev's younger brother. Oh, and I agree, Mukhtar Ablyazov, no.
Right, so I think the question about why the coup, right, and the timing and what sparked this, this also raises a larger issue for me. How, what is that legitimate protest and what was the role and how serious of a threat from the position of the elite was the genuine protest that we know there was a genuine protest. It was sort of reasonable to expect that the hike in your fuel prices twice, right? So, you know, doubling the fuel prices would lead to the spark of popular protest, and this happened, right? And whether it was so scary this time around, given the overall decline and inability to use other resources to pacify the population, that could have been sort of that spark that led to the coup. So.
Great. And there's lots more that could be said, but we're already into the time of the next panel because there's no breaks between them. I see from the schedule. So I
just wanted to respond to the CSTO.
Can I suggest that we hold off on that, just because I don't want to steal time for the next panel, which is large and we're already late. So please, thank you for your patience, and please join me in thanking